Hi guys, welcome to Novum and welcome to me taking a very quick break from the complete guide to Beau's Afraid to look at the Eddington teaser trailer that just dropped. It's probably not a video I'm going to keep up indefinitely, it will be quite lacking in production standards for which I apologise, but I'm really excited to talk about the film with you guys, so I thought I'd just do something quickly off the cuff. If you're not aware, Eddington is Ari Aster's upcoming film, described by Variety as a COVID western, starring Joaquin Phoenix, Pedro Pascal, Emma Stone, and Austin Butler. It definitely looks to be Ari Aster's most politically controversial film. We're not just discussing COVID here, we're looking at themes of political anger that were present in Midsommar, and anger towards unjust killings by police officers we see hinted at during Beau's Afraid, and generally that very tense political climate America was facing in 2020. But this time we're taking those themes on in a more explicit way that is bound to be quite divisive, because these things usually are, but I'm expecting it to poke fun at both sides of the divide. Pandemic cinema in general has been relatively sparse thus far. I think perhaps because as it was happening, our media reflected it in the moment. Newscasters sitting further apart, people being interviewed in their bedrooms, limited sets. We haven't made much COVID media because COVID was the media during the whole affair. People were making pandemic movies as the pandemic was happening. But undeniably, the other side of the coin is that it represents a trauma the world would rather move past. If you think about cinema following 9/11, that was relatively sparse for the first few years too. But 4 or 5 years on, and we started getting 9/11 imagery in action films, there was a 2 or 3 year period where every film seemed to end with a doom portal appearing in the skies over a crowded city. We also started getting films that dealt with it more directly, like United 93, Remember Me, Zero Dark 30, and so on. So I think it's probably about that time that we start seeing more media about the pandemic rather than media of the pandemic. And even though we may not want to hear about it, I think we are ready to make fun of it. So I'm super excited that we're getting Aster's almost certainly very dark rendition of it. Before we look through the trailer, because it isn't very long, I thought we'd look at the poster as well. I absolutely love the branding for the film so far, and this is the high point for me. We've got that black and white classic Western look being contrasted against quite a brutal and unsettling image in the foreground. Buffaloes following each other off a cliff. This is actually a 1988 photo by David Wojnarowicz of a diorama simulating a bison or buffalo jump, a Native American hunting method where the animals were herded into a stampede towards a cliff edge. The photo reflects Wojnarowicz's stark and brutal view of the decade, specifically the AIDS pandemic of which he himself was a victim. I think that link exists primarily through homosexual people very tragically facing down the feeling that they were being pushed towards extinction via rapid extermination, just like the buffalo were as AIDS ran rampant through the late 1980s. But we can also say there's a feeling of maliciousness to it, of the unseen party that pushed the buffalo, being the uncaring and lackluster government response, and the horrid sensation that the buffalo were following each other off the cliff, that people were ignorant to the dangers and that was leading to mass infections. To quote the Chicago Art Institute, the image embodies the tragedy of the pandemic and offers an indictment of a nation at odds with itself. And doesn't that sound eerily familiar to the 2020 pandemic? I think hopefully the illusion is quite clear, and the image is wonderfully fitting here as we're exploring the pandemic mindset of a nation at odds with itself, as somehow the response to a virus became politicized, and both opposing sides played follow their leader all the way off a cliff as our thinking became very extreme and polarized while a very serious and life-threatening calamity was taking place. And just as another fun little link, think of how many times during that pandemic we were all referred to as a herd. Our herd immunity, and so on. It just felt like the new buzzword at the time, but looking at this image, thinking about the cattle comparison, there is an extremely dark undertone to it that's very much still present in the original photograph. So that's the buffalo, but what about the tagline? Hindsight is 2020. I absolutely love this. It's such a clever tagline, something we all recognize that's being cast in an entirely new light with the slightest wordplay imaginable. It makes for a very clever allusion to a time we all deeply regret. And let's think about that word regret, because that's usually what hindsight is. What could we have done better? And while the trailer is seemingly poking a lot of fun at conspiracy theories, I think that alone doesn't really amount to our need for hindsight. The fact people were convinced Tom Hanks was a Satanist doesn't really feel worthy of this suggested global hindsight, especially when contrasted against the flawed, insane, and often corrupt manner in which the pandemic was handled and how vicious public discourse became. So I really don't think the film is going to be as politically straightforward as conspiracy theories are bad. That's just not complex enough for Asta. I'm fully expecting this to be a both sides bad situation, especially given his love of flawed and disagreeable characters. And so I imagine this hindsight will relate more to how we ended up treating one another and the level of tension that was present in America during the pandemic, and specifically in the wake of George Floyd's death. Alright, I'd just like to add a quick disclaimer before we begin properly. I am aware of the set leaks. We will not be discussing them, so please no mention of them in the comments, and please avoid looking online for them if you haven't seen them. I think they represent the worst kind of potential spoiler. With that out of the way, let's start moving through the trailer, and we start big with Ari Aster filling the screen because A24 knows who the GOAT is. From here, the majority of the trailer is an Instagram doom scroll through the events occurring in the town of Eddington. We begin with an unknown narrator discussing Tom Hanks' links to the pandemic, specifically that he was born in the same year a lab in Wuhan was opened. This is of course referencing the booming popularity of Tom Hanks' satanic child-eating conspiracies around the start of the lockdowns. The trailer doesn't quite say as much, but the allusion is pretty obvious, and so we're already treading quite risky ground in terms of how personal that is and how close to home this all feels. I'm sure we all saw one or two shorts linking Tom Hanks to Baphomet because of a painting in his bathroom or something, and when we combine this with the later posts we see from @BenghaziDad linking Michael Jackson to the Twin Towers, I think we could say it's a pretty fair bet that conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking in general are going to play a pretty major role here. And while we're hearing about Tom Hanks, we're seeing this weather report, a scorching hot June 2020, and this isn't just setting the scene, this is something I recognized immediately, something that actually confirms something I said during the Midsummer video, that Asta was using the Haugers' hottest summer on record as a metaphor for this brewing nationalist sentiment, in Sweden and probably America too, this emboldening of far-right voices and a feeling of approaching a boiling point with issues like racial tension, immigration, and so on. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. It's a boiling point of racial tension and national division, and it's happening during this week of intense heat. If you're interested in hearing lots more about that, it occurs around 2 hours 50 minutes into my complete guide to Midsummer. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway from that is that Asta's still playing with prior motifs. There's still this sense of concurrency in the work. A lot of people, myself included, felt like Beau is Afraid would act like a bit of a capstone to Asta's previous work, and Eddington was potentially going to be a very clean break. I think it's clear it feels different to his previous work, certainly the truest to life, but it's also good to see that his previous motifs are still being iterated upon. There is something else here, however, the decision to use the sun at all, and this relates directly to the title Eddington. This is likely a reference to the Eddington limit. To quote Google, the maximum luminosity a celestial object can emit while maintaining hydrostatic equilibrium, where the inward force of gravity is balanced by the outward force of radiation pressure. In simpler terms, it's the point where the radiation pressure becomes so strong that it begins to push material away from the object, preventing further accretion. So we're having the same thing alluded to, a boiling or breaking point, an apex to this public outrage that once we pass beyond it, things start devolving rapidly. And to tie that in with this very hot week where the sun is reaching an apex, it's very clever stuff, and I'm extremely excited for this film. Alright, following that, we get our first look at Joaquin Phoenix's Sheriff Joe Cross, issuing a warning that if you value your life, you should think twice, because the people of Eddington like guns. He's wearing a cowboy hat at a press conference. He's issuing these broad-reaching threats about his freedom and his right to bear arms. There's a lot of comparisons we can make to real-world figures. The more bombastic and sometimes problematic examples of real-world sheriffs. But speaking broadly, I think he represents that kind of rural right-wing volatility that responds extremely aggressively to any perceived threat to their freedom. A group heavily concerned with gun control and avoiding governmental interference. Given what Joe is saying at the press conference, that may be something that comes up directly. And I think we get a lot of that just from his second name, Cross. The name clearly alluding to, Bible Belt Christian America, but also perhaps to anger too, to be cross. So the anger of rural Christian America might be a better way of looking at it, and that seems to fit perfectly with what little we see from Joe. There is also perhaps a hidden allusion to the KKK here, given the branding of each of Joe's 3 news microphones starts with the letter K. Next up, we have Austin Butler's character, Vernon Jefferson Peake, which seems to be a mashup reference to both George Washington via the Mount Vernon estate and Thomas Jefferson via Jefferson Peak. It's just a guess, but given his preachy, cult leader-esque style, perhaps this is an allusion to his desire to found some new kind of America. He certainly seems to have that woo-woo bullshit spiritual patter down as he says, "You are not a coincidence. We are not a coincidence. And take back your mind, reclaim your identity." And I get the feeling he maybe doesn't believe his own bullshit. He sounds like a preacher, but I think his look is giving more Russell Brand spiritual grift. I certainly have the feeling that this is going to be the quasi-spiritual, quasi-conspiratorial grifter figure that we absolutely saw multiply during the pandemic. Someone that seems to go full circle from levitating pyramids back to hard-pushing Christianity, perfectly in line with their next controversy. Someone pushing alternate or fringe theories not through legitimate belief, but a desire for personal gain. I also think there might be shades of a figure that appears in the original script for Beau's Afraid, but not in the actual film. The same archetype, maybe. I don't want to say too much about that in case I'm right, but you can go look up the Beau's Afraid script if you're interested. And from there we move to Emma Stone, or Louise Cross, presumably the wife of Joaquin's Joe Cross, issuing a public denial of her husband's previous statements. Given that it's a denial rather than a condemnation or a retraction, potentially it's some wild conspiracy about her, or some wildly fallacious or provocative statement her husband has made. I think perhaps this could be a sign of the political divide, not just putting a community in conflict, but individual marriages too. We don't hear much from her, but she doesn't seem to share the same aggression we see from Joe, so perhaps it's a bit of a partnership of opposites. Whatever the case, I am extremely excited to see Emma Stone in an Ari Aster project. I think she's absolutely fantastic. Another actor who we won't see in the trailer but is in the film, Michael Ward from Top Boy, very excited to see him too. We then get an account called Sarah_Bernie or Bust. Sarah is a character in the film, played by Amelie Hoferler. Bernie or Bust suggesting she's firmly on the left side of the divide, and her somewhat vapid TikTok dancing behind this quite highbrow caption leads me to believe we'll be seeing the left lampooned here as well as the right. The caption reads, "When you finish reading James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room," which is perhaps the most explicit Ari Aster's ever been with his literary references. I haven't read Giovanni's Room, but I have ordered a copy in preparation. From what I gather, it's a narrative about the protagonist's coming to terms with his homosexuality and his love affair with a man named Giovanni. I won't spoil the book for you, but they're treated, let's just say, unjustly by society, by the powers that be, and so I think this is likely a reference to her becoming woke to new injustices, having read the book, but that is also two intertextual references between the poster and the trailer, and both have been directly concerned with historic issues facing the gay community, so that may well be a theme here too. But for Sarah, this post definitely seems to be about rebellion against authority. She's captioned it 1 like equals 1 ACAB, and from this point on the trailer takes a slight turn in theme, moving from Wuhan and 9/11 to the BLM movement and anti-police sentiment that pervaded the pandemic. We see someone posting a black square, something very specifically related to George Floyd and BLM and the social media protests or blackouts that took place following. And we go from that straight into Pedro Pascal's Mayor Ted Garcia promising to continue leading the town and fighting the pandemic and the racial and economic issues. And these racial issues could be anti-Mexican, it could be anti-Chinese sentiment, given how problematic even saying Wuhan was at one point, but I think we can generally assume this is again in reference to the fallout from George Floyd and the other surrounding injustices that drove racial tensions to a boiling point. I think we can say Teds are symbolic and actual representative of government, so we've got a sheriff that doesn't like being told what to do, a sheriff who doesn't want the people's guns taken away, and a politician representing that exact type of overreach, promising to keep the community safe. The conflict there should be quite apparent, and we can see from the video caption this emphasis on keeping it safe for every member of the community, so I think we can assume Ted's more on the side of inclusivity and acceptance, but we'll see how that works out, because again, I get the feeling that neither side is going to be very likable here. There's also a moment of up-scrolling That moment where you stop your infinite doom plunge and go back the other way because something caught your eye as Pedro Pascal comes onto screen. Now this could simply be alluding to the major conflict between them, as we've already had hinted via this promo, but given this phone is being operated by Joaquin Phoenix, I think we can certainly detect a degree of fixation or perhaps obsession there. And given he's scrolling alone in bed, given we know his wife is at odds with him, given we have only 2 intertextual references so far and both of them majorly concern homosexuality, maybe there's also a bit of a love-hate relationship between the two, a bit of repressed desire, perhaps. It's an Ari Aster film, so I think anything is possible, and I certainly think the geography and cultural climate lend themselves to that notion of repressed desire and America in conflict with itself. And murder is certainly confirmed for us as the next reel informs us that Law and Order Sheriff Joe Cross has assaulted a protester in town rocked by murders. So not only has the violence already begun, but it's also perhaps progressing out of Joe's hands. And his description as the Law and Order Sheriff again speaks to this kind of outspoken, old school in the worst way kind of sheriff that believes in harsh punishments and outdated values. It's difficult to make out exactly what Joe says to camera, but if the captions are to be believed, he's saying it was an accident I'm trying to explain. I very much get the feeling that this is going to be a comedy of errors as much as it's outright maliciousness, and I love how the crowd are kind of closing in on Joe like a herd of zombies. Really unsettlingly familiar imagery. And from there we cut to Joaquin doom scrolling on his bed, and I think that's really interesting. It was a really interesting decision to make this trailer pretty much entirely an Instagram feed, especially when we consider that this is primarily how we consumed the pandemic, scrolling away on our phones in some craven mixture of ultra boredom and abject terror, and in particular here it's emphasizing the divided view of America being presented to us through social media as we're constantly blasted with the extremes of both sides in bite-sized and often bombastic videos, and how social media doing that is driving a self-sustaining and ever-growing wedge in the divide and encouraging a constant cycle of escalation in rhetoric and tension. And Joaquin's almost ambivalent, glazed stare at the phone as he consumes this terror feed, that's something we've seen Ari Aster do before too, this disconnection people feel when shielded by their phone, when looking through their phone, the screen and lens providing a barrier from reality and a layer of disconnection from the subject. Again, really excited to see him iterate on these ideas further, and it seems to be a big focus here. And then we cut out to the Eddington title, and that's it. Not very much to go on, but I'm a big fan of that. It just shows us the tone of the movie, the themes it's exploring, and gave us nothing of the actual plot. I don't need to see any more from a trailer than that. I don't really like trying to detect the movie from the trailer normally, but in this case I made a special exception because I know there's a lot of Ari Aster superfans here, and we'll take any Aster we can get. Really, really awesome stuff. I really enjoyed it, and I'm absolutely bloody hyped to see this movie. I hope you are too. Alright, that's everything for this video, guys. Let me know if you did enjoy it, and maybe I'll do another when we get a full-length trailer. I'm currently undecided on that. If you want more conversational content like this from me, you can sign up at patreon.com/Novum. We've got hours of discussion on Suspiria, The Substance, Longlegs, True Detective, The Haunting of Hill House, and lots more. Big thank you to everyone supporting me there already. For anyone interested, Beau is Afraid is coming along nicely. I'm fully into the script writing phase now, and I've already got so many things I can't wait to share with you guys. Okay, please let me know what you think of the trailer in the comments. I've got to get back to work on Beau. Peace.